I'd like to introduce our guest this evening. We're going to be talking about tobacco harm reduction, which is essentially it's a theory that smoking cigarettes is bad, but if you can't quit, it's better to use another product which also might be hazardous, but it's a lot less hazardous than sucking in cigarette smoke into your lungs. That's what's called tobacco harm reduction theory or therapy. And the reason folks are a bit suspicious of it, if I might say, is that this sort of thing is encouraged by tobacco companies and financed by them. And we'll see if we can kind of sort out whether it makes any sense when you consider that factor. Anyway, we have Mr. Brad Rodu. He is a professor at the University of Louisville's Medical School. He is a holder of an endowed chair of tobacco harm reduction, and he's a dentist by training. We also have with us Representative Alan Fair, as in fair and balanced, as right. He said. And he is a member of the House Human Services Committee, which held a hearing on a concurrent resolution that suggests that the legislature over the next 2 years study the subject of tobacco harm reduction. Now, how this works is if this resolution is approved by the House and Senate, then it will go into a stack of resolutions that the legislature will consider as a study subject for the next 2 years. And if it's studied, then we'll be collecting a lot of information about this subject. Mr. Rodu, first of all, could you tell me about tobacco harm reduction and how you got into this subject?
Well, as you said, I'm a dentist, but I'm also an oral and maxillofacial pathologist. It's been my job for the last 25 to 30 years to look into a microscope and find mouth cancer under the microscope from biopsies from people's mouths. And after about 12 years of practicing oral pathology, in the middle of the Deep South at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, I started to notice that I was not seeing cases of mouth cancer in people who use smokeless tobacco. And this was a disconnect because I was teaching my medical and dental students that it was a death sentence for mouth cancer. And so I started to do research on this, published my first paper in 1994, and that research shows that smokeless tobacco use is 98% safer than smoking. And in fact, is so safe that we can barely measure the actual health risks with any precision. And so I started to outline in professional papers a way that smokers, if they were unable or unwilling to quit tobacco entirely, and we've got lots of them, that they could switch to a vastly safer product, thus reducing their health risks.
Have your research findings been duplicated by anyone in terms of the relative risk involved in smokeless tobacco use?
It's now widely known among scientists who study tobacco issues that smokeless tobacco products are, in fact, vastly safer than smoking. There's no question about that. In fact, the British Royal College of Physicians in 2002 said that smokeless tobacco is 10 to 1,000 times less hazardous than smoking. So this is an established fact. It's a matter of how we're going to implement those strategies to help smokers lead longer and healthier lives.
The fact that you said that smoking is much more hazardous than smokeless tobacco use, is that a function of smokeless tobacco use being relatively safe, or is it a function of smoking being quite harmful for you?
Well, clearly smoking's harmful. But the key here is nicotine is the reason people smoke. It's the addiction. But it's not the killer. Smoke is the killer. It's the delivery system. Smoke contains 3,000 to 5,000 different chemicals that ultimately result in a 20 or 30-year career in lung cancer, heart disease, stroke, and emphysema. Taking that nicotine in a smoke-free form, whether it's in smokeless tobacco products or e-cigarettes, again, is vastly safer. Now, no one is saying that it's perfectly safe. But we need to let smokers know this so they can ultimately make a choice And we can avoid those almost 900 deaths that are occurring in North Dakota each and every year.
Why not nicotine gum? Wouldn't that be just as good as putting smokeless tobacco in your mouth?
Nicotine gum is a great substitute, but it's meant to wean smokers to nothing, basically to wean them to abstinence over about a 10-week period. So nicotine gum is made to be non-addictive and unsatisfying for smokers. So a smoker walks into a pharmacy, it's $30 to $50, number one. It's a medicine. It's expensive, and most smokers don't have that in their pocket. Number two, they get it home, and it's unsatisfying. It just doesn't provide the nicotine kick that smokers need when they smoke or use a tobacco product. And for those reasons, nicotine has been shown in meta-analyses and large studies to have a success rate of exactly 7%. That's a 93% failure rate for an FDA-approved medicine. We have to do better.
Representative Fair, what did you think of this idea? I mean, you sit on the House Human Services Committee, and you listened to the testimony about this resolution. Tell me what your impressions were of it and the efficacy of it.
Well, first of all, let me say that this is a resolution different than most bills, but like most bills, the first thing that happens, it's introduced, we hear testimony in favor, we hear testimony opposed, and then we sit back and maybe it's a day or the same day or a week or whatever, but then eventually we get back together and discuss it as a committee. So we've heard testimony. We have not as a committee discussed this. But as a resolution, it's a resolution saying that the legislative management should do a study. And so it starts off as a resolution with the whereas this, whereas this, whereas this, whereas this, and it goes on to say, and therefore, and be it resolved that there will be a study with results coming back in 2 years.
Do you think that there's any point to doing a study of this subject, the legislature doing one?
Well, to tell you the truth, I haven't made up my mind on that. I'm still kind of looking at it, and the problem that I'm having with it is I'm a facts guy. I'm interested. Give me the facts. And so to begin with, when we started this, is we've got somebody who is flown in, and he's not hired by a tobacco company, but his employer gets tobacco funds. His travel up here, again, is not a tobacco company, but it's financed by an agency that apparently takes tobacco funds. So there's at least some contamination in terms of saying, is he an independent researcher? No, I don't think so. Does that mean his research is bad? Not necessarily. You know, it just tells me I'm trying to weigh out the facts.
Mr. Rodu, how do you deal with the factor that Representative Fair just mentioned? I mean, are you some tobacco industry shill, or what are you?
I'm a professor at a major medical school in the Midwest. And if what I was saying was wrong, then that university would not have me on its faculty. I started publishing in this field in 1994. And from 1994 to 1999, I published a series of papers that were supported only by my department. And my critics said I was a tobacco industry shill. And then we ran out of money, and the traditional funding agencies in this country, the National Institutes of Health, the American Cancer Society, they rejected any consideration of this. And so we turned to the tobacco industry. And from 1999 till now, I have those funds. But those funds went to my universities. They were managed by my universities according to all university standards. And in fact, we impose standards on these that other grants don't have. For example, we determined that we would not consider any we don't consider that the grants are restricted in any way. So we have complete authority over exactly what we do with the money. But we do have money in which to conduct further research. I used those funds to go to Sweden in 2002, from which I was able to describe this idea really having a population benefit in Sweden. It's now resulted in Swedish men living longer and suffering less smoking-related disease than any other men in the European Union. And we were able to use this to bring that experience back to the United States. So I understand that my critics will call this a tobacco industry front, but I ask them to look at the science, because the science is there and the science is solid.
Do you think that the tobacco industry would be supporting this work if your conclusions were that smokeless tobacco was not that much less dangerous than smoking?
They don't have a choice. They don't have a choice. Once they've given the funds to the university, they don't have a choice. And I'll give you an example. We had our first grant in 1999. In 2003, I published the first study of tobacco-specific nitrosamines, a contaminant that is a bit of a toxic agent in tobacco products. And my funding source had the highest levels of that agent in their products. We published it. We published the truth. And so the funding does not affect what we produce and our results. And so I feel we have independence and integrity in the presentation of our work.
I know you mentioned that your data has shown that smokeless tobacco is less hazardous than smoking. But isn't, frankly, there something inherently kind of disgusting about taking a big wad of tobacco and sticking it between your teeth and gum?
Absolutely. Traditional smokeless tobacco products have that spitting image. Absolutely. But modern products can be used invisibly. Now, again, I'm not promoting tobacco use, but smokers need to know that they can use modern products spit-free. The Swedes taught us that. They take their packet of tobacco, they place it in their upper lip that causes no spitting. So we do have ways that this can be socially acceptable. It's less hazardous, but it can also be socially acceptable for most smokers, men and women. And in fact, my Swedish studies show that recently, as late as 2004, Swedish women have adopted snus use from their husbands, because they're seeing that it's safer and it's socially acceptable.
Where do e-cigarettes fall in this continuum? I mean, are they useful in terms of trying to wean people off of cigarettes?
E-cigarettes are an excellent substitute.
First of all, can you explain what an e-cigarette is?
An e-cigarette is a tube that contains a solution of nicotine, glycerin or propylene glycol, and water. And when a user pulls on it or drags on it, it releases a vapor containing those things. And so this vapor delivers nicotine. It delivers it in a way that satisfies smokers' behavioral needs, and it's vastly safer. Now, they've only been available since 2006, so we don't have 5 decades of epidemiologic studies that we have with smokeless tobacco, none of which those epidemiologic studies were funded by the tobacco industry. But we don't have the epidemiology, but we have to know that a vapor is much less hazardous than smoke. And so we're comfortable. And in fact, I conducted the first ever community smoking cessation program in Owensboro, Kentucky. And we actually recommended that smokers switch to either smokeless tobacco or e-cigarettes.
Do state health departments generally support what you're doing?
No. State health departments join most of the medical organizations in this country to try to have smokers abstain from all tobacco use. They have, as a vision, a tobacco-free society. And I'll leave it up to your listeners to their opinion on whether or not we can actually achieve a tobacco-free society.
To what extent do you do this with other state legislatures? I mean, do you go around and testify on like resolutions of this nature in other states?
I've had the opportunity to present my findings and to educate lawmakers in several states.
Which ones?
Well, there was a hearing. We had a hearing in Kansas last year. There's been a hearing in Oklahoma. I've talked with legislators in several different states.
What resulted from these hearings? Anything?
We had a hearing in Indiana, and they have embedded language about tobacco harm reduction in legislation, as has my home state of Kentucky. The tobacco harm reduction is now seen as an option for smokers to some extent.
I had never heard of tobacco harm reduction until a few days ago. How recent a discipline, if you can call it that, is this?
Well, I've been publishing since 1994. In 2003, the U.S. Congress held a hearing. It was a House of Representatives committee hearing, which I testified at. And since then, there has been a growing awareness that this can be an acceptable option for smokers.
We're speaking to Brad Rodu, who is a professor at the University of Louisville Medical School. We've also been speaking to Representative Alan Fair of Dickinson. He's a Republican. He sits on the House Human Services Committee, which is considering a study resolution as to whether the legislature should take a closer look during the next 2 years at the theory of tobacco harm reduction, which essentially attempts to persuade people who smoke cigarettes to switch to less hazardous forms of tobacco use. Thank you all.